The year is 3200 BCE. The place? A flat expanse between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. Mesopotamia, the land between the waters. The sun rises over a landscape that looks almost alien compared to the world we know. No jaiguas. No cities as we understand them. Just mud-brick structures rising from the earth like geometric mountains. And towering above them all, the Ziggurat, a massive step pyramid, each level smaller than the one below, climbing toward the heavens. Its walls painted white and blue, gleaming in the early morning light. To the people who built it, this was more than architecture. It was the literal meeting point between earth and sky, between humanity and the divine. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. These ziggurats, these temples to the gods, were also the world's first banks. Let me say that again slowly because it's important. The ziggurats of ancient Sumer were not just places of worship. They were warehouses, accounting centers, the beating heart of the world's first complex economy. And inside these massive structures, sitting at wooden desks in dim chambers lit by oil lamps, were the world's first accountants. Priests in linen robes, holding styluses made of reed, pressing symbols into soft clay. They weren't writing prayers. They were writing receipts. The problem of abundance. To understand why this matters, we need to go back to the problem we discussed in the previous chapter. Agriculture created surplus. For the first time in human history, you could produce more than you needed to survive. But surplus creates a new problem. Storage. Where do you keep 10,000 bushels of grain? How do you prevent it from rotting? From being eaten by rats? From being stolen? And more importantly, how do you track it? Because in a village of 50 people, memory works fine. Everyone knows who contributed what, who owes what to whom. But in a city of 5,000 people, 10,000, 50,000, memory fails. Trust breaks down. You need a system. And so, the Sumerians invented one. They designated the temple, the most sacred, most protected building in the city, as the central storehouse. Farmers brought their surplus grain to the temple. The priests weighed it, measured it, recorded it on clay tablets. In return, the farmer received a token, a small clay object, sometimes shaped like a cone or a sphere, representing a specific quantity of grain. This token was proof, evidence, a contract between the farmer and the temple. I gave you 12 bushels. This token says so. When I need to withdraw grain, I present this token, and you return what is mine. Simple, elegant, revolutionary. Because what the Sumerians had just invented, without fully realizing it, was abstract accounting. The grain wasn't just grain anymore. It was a number, an entry in a ledger, a symbol pressed into clay. And symbols can be manipulated in ways that physical grain cannot. The birth of writing. Accounting before poetry. Here's a fact that most people find surprising. Writing, one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements, was not invented to record stories, not to preserve myths, not to write love letters or philosophical treatises. Writing was invented to track debt. The earliest known written documents are not epics or hymns. They are receipts. Clay tablets from Uruk, circa 3200 BCE, bearing symbols in a script we now call cuneiform. And what do these tablets say? Enki, 29 bushels of barley, delivered to the temple, witnessed by Nana, priest of Inanna. Lugal owes 14 jugs of oil, to be repaid after harvest. Interest, 1 jug per year, line after line, name after name, numbers, quantities, obligations. The stylus pressing into wet clay made wedge-shaped marks. Cuneus in Latin, wedge, cuneiform, and each wedge represented something revolutionary, permanence. Before writing, agreements existed in memory, spoken, temporary, subject to dispute. I never agreed to that. Yes, you did. I remember clearly. No, you're misremembering. But clay tablets don't misremember. They don't forget. They don't die. A debt recorded in clay is a debt that persists beyond the lifespan of memory, beyond the lifespan of the individuals involved. Your grandfather's debt becomes your father's debt. Your father's debt becomes your debt. Obligation becomes hereditary. And suddenly, humans are no longer just individuals. We are entries in a ledger, numbers in an accounting system, our existence, our worth, our obligations, all reducible to marks pressed into clay by a priest we've never met. Think about that for a moment. The invention of writing didn't free us. It bound us. It created a system where debt could outlive the person who incurred it, where obligation could be passed down through generations like genetic inheritance. And we've been living in that system ever since. Mas. When money learned to give birth. Now let's talk about interest, because interest is one of the strangest concepts in human economics. And understanding where it came from reveals something profound about how we think about wealth. In ancient Sumer, the word for interest was mas. But mas didn't originally mean interest. It meant calf, as in a baby cow. Why? Because to the Sumerians, this made perfect sense. If you lend someone a cow and they keep it for a year, it's only fair that you get back your original cow plus any calves it produced during that time. The cow was productive. It generated offspring. So the return should include that natural increase. Now, extend this logic to grain. You lend someone grain. They plant it. It grows. They harvest more grain than you originally lent them. So when they repay you, shouldn't you receive not just the original grain, but a portion of what it produced? This is the birth of interest. The idea that wealth is not static, that it reproduces, that money, like livestock, can give birth to more money. And once this idea takes hold, everything changes. Because now, lending isn't just a favor. It's an investment. The temple priests realized this quickly. They had surplus grain. Farmers needed seed grain to plant. So the temple would lend grain to farmers at planting season. And when the farmers harvested, they would repay the grain plus a percentage, typically 20 to 33%. 1/3 of your harvest returned to the temple as payment for the seed loan. This wasn't seen as exploitation. This was seen as natural, fair, the offspring of the loan. But here's where it gets dark. What happens when the harvest fails? What happens when drought, flood, or locusts destroy the crop? The farmer still owes the debt. The clay tablet doesn't care about weather. The ledger doesn't forgive because times are hard. So the debt rolls over, accumulates, grows, and the interest compounds. 1 bad year becomes 2. 2 becomes 5. 5 becomes a lifetime. And eventually, the farmer has nothing left to give except himself, the ledger and the soul. This is the moment we need to pause and recognize. For the first time in human history, a person's worth could be quantified, reduced to a number. You weren't just Enki the farmer anymore. You were Enki, 47 bushels in debt. Your identity, your status, your freedom, all dependent on what the clay tablet said about you. And if the tablet said you owed more than you could ever repay, you became property. Debt slavery. Not slavery by conquest, not slavery by birth, but slavery by mathematics. You or your children or your grandchildren would work in the fields of the temple or the estates of wealthy landowners until the debt was repaid, which, given compound interest, might be never. The Ziggurat, that towering monument to the gods, was also a prison, a system of control more powerful than any army, because you couldn't run from a debt recorded in clay. Every city recognized these tablets. Every temple kept records. Your debt followed you, marked you, owned you. And the priests who managed these ledgers, they weren't just religious figures. They were the first bankers, the first financial administrators. They controlled the economy not through violence, but through information. They knew who owed what, who was reliable, who was risky, who could be trusted with more credit, who needed to be foreclosed upon. This was power of a new kind. Not the power of the sword, but the power of the stylus. Not the power to take life, but the power to define life in terms of debt and obligation. The first debt crisis. Inevitably, this system created crises. By 2400 BCE, debt had become so widespread, so crushing, that entire populations were on the verge of collapse. Farmers abandoned their fields. Families fled their cities. Social unrest spread like fire. Because when enough people owe more than they can repay, the system breaks down. There's no one left to do the work. No one left to pay taxes. No one left to fight in the army. The kings of Sumer faced a choice: watch their kingdoms collapse, or do something radical. And so, they did something that modern economists would consider insane. They canceled the debts. All of them. This practice was called amargy, often translated as return to mother, but carrying a deeper meaning: freedom, liberation, a debt jubilee. The king would issue a decree. All private debts, debts owed to the temple, to wealthy landowners, to merchants, were forgiven. Debt slaves were freed. Foreclosed land was returned to original owners. The slate was wiped clean, and society reset. Now, here's what's fascinating. This wasn't a one-time emergency measure. This happened regularly, periodically. Kings understood something that modern economists often forget. Debt, left unchecked, destroys the social fabric. If you let debt accumulate indefinitely, you end up with a tiny class of creditors owning everything, and a massive class of debtors owning nothing. And that's not a sustainable society. That's a powder keg. So the debt jubilees served as a pressure release valve. A recognition that the accounting system, however sophisticated, was still just a tool, a means to an end. And when the tool stopped serving society and started destroying it, you put the tool down. You smashed the tablets. You started over. The psychology of the ledger. But here's the thing about systems. Once they're created, they're very hard to dismantle. Even when the debts were canceled, the idea of debt remained. The ledgers were wiped clean, but the practice of recording, tracking, measuring obligation, that continued. Because the alternative, returning to a world without accounting, without records, without systematic tracking of resources, was unthinkable. The population had grown too large. The economy too complex. The cities too dependent on coordinated surplus management. So the tablets continued. The scribes continued. The temples continued to function as banks. And humans adjusted to this new reality. We internalized the ledger. We began to think of ourselves in terms of assets and liabilities. What we owed. What was owed to us. Our net worth. This is a profound psychological shift. And we don't talk about it enough. For the vast majority of human existence, your value was intrinsic. You were valued for your skills, your relationships, your role in the community. But once the ledger appears, your value becomes extrinsic. Numerical. Comparative. You're worth what the tablets say you're worth. And this mindset, this reduction of human life to accounting entries, is still with us today. When we talk about someone's net worth, when we measure success in dollars, when we reduce human potential to economic productivity, we're still thinking like Sumerian priests pressing symbols into clay. We're still trapped in the logic of the ledger. The temple as machine. Let's return to the ziggurat. Because there's one more thing we need to understand about these structures. They weren't just buildings. They were machines. Economic engines. The temple controlled vast estates, employed thousands of workers, managed irrigation systems, agricultural production, textile manufacturing, metalworking, long-distance trade, and all of it was tracked, recorded, optimized. The priests weren't mystical figures lost in prayer. They were administrators, managers, optimizers. They calculated yields, projected harvests, allocated resources, set prices, managed supply chains. The ziggurat was the world's first corporation. And the priests? the first MBAs. We like to think of ancient civilizations as simple, primitive, guided by superstition and ritual. But the Sumerians weren't primitive. They were sophisticated. They had complex mathematics, advanced astronomy, hydraulic engineering, legal codes, educational systems, and at the center of it all, accounting. Because civilization at its core is about managing complexity. And you can't manage complexity without information, without records, without a system that tracks flows, measures inputs and outputs, allocates resources rationally. The Ziggurat provided that system. And in doing so, it created something that had never existed before. A society organized not around kinship, not around tribal loyalty, but around economic relationships. You weren't valuable because you were part of the chief's family. You were valuable because you produced something the system needed. You weren't obligated to others because they were your kin. You were obligated because the clay tablet said so. This was the birth of impersonal economics. And it was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant you could rise through merit, through productivity, through skill, regardless of your birth. Terrifying because it meant you could also fall, could be reduced to nothing, could become just another failed entry in an endless ledger of debts. The echo across millennia. So what does all of this mean for us? Now, today, in the 21st century, it means that the systems we live in, banking, credit, debt, interest, accounting, are not new inventions. They are ancient, 5,000 years old. We are still pressing symbols into clay, except now we call it data entry, digital ledgers, blockchain. We still measure human worth in terms of assets and liabilities, except now we call it credit scores, net worth, market value. We still struggle with debt crises, except now we don't have debt jubilees. We have bailouts, bankruptcies, austerity. The Sumerians understood something we've forgotten. That debt, when it becomes too heavy, must be forgiven. Not out of charity but out of necessity. Because systems that crush the majority eventually collapse. But we've lost that wisdom. We treat debt as sacred, inviolable, a moral obligation that transcends practical considerations. You borrowed it, you owe it. No matter what. Even when repaying it is impossible. Even when it destroys lives. Families, communities, we've become more rigid than the ancient priests, more bound to the ledger than the people who invented it. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Mesopotamia, that the tools we create to manage complexity can become prisons, that the systems we design to serve us can become masters, that writing, this incredible gift, this extension of human memory and thought, was first used not to liberate us but to bind us. To turn us into entries in a ledger, to make us calculable, controllable, reducible, and 5,000 years later, we're still calculating, still controlling, still reducing. The Ziggurat stands in ruins now, eroded by time, reclaimed by sand. But the ledger is immortal.